I don't know if it's exclusive to our corner of the United States, but I do know my division within the Park Service is a bit untraditional. We help keep the parks clean, of course. We rout out the teenagers that get too rowdy, and we cooperate with the fire department when lightning strikes the wrong tree. But we have another responsibility. It's a team of myself and 13 others. There's an official name for us that I can't share, but amongst ourselves we're called the Finders. What we do is find the things that no one in their right mind wants to look for. Scary things do live in the national parks. Scary things live everywhere, as a matter of fact. It's thanks to the United States government that in our areas, we can preserve the beautiful sides of nature while stopping the spread of her nastier inhabitants. There's a lick of truth in a lot of the weird stories that come out of these parks. I've got a story of my own. Unfortunately, this story does start with tragedy. I think the greatest lessons all begin with something of that scope. Something has to be lost for something to be learned. Anyway, a hiker had gone missing. This was roughly 15 years ago. We'd recovered their campsite, but there wasn't any sign of the individual in question. More mysteriously, their tent was recovered some 100 yards from the campsite itself. The structure was in ruins, shredded into thin strips of fabric. The metal beams that formed its shape were bent and broken. Theories were rampant regarding how the tent could have traveled so far. Those of us in the Finders knew it was likely that something had dragged it. The wind hadn't been strong enough to move the tent that far, let alone to tie the metal stakes into knots. Hopes of finding the hiker in one piece were fizzling out. The rest of the Park Service was busy looking for them while we were tasked with finding whatever could have taken her. We had our theories, of course. I'm sure by now you've heard stories about the strange creatures living in our national parks. Draw one of their names out of a hat, and we likely considered them a suspect. We needed to be more concerned with evidence than theories, though. There weren't any footprints or drag marks leading out of the campsite, although some unreliable prints had been picked up leading into the space. They were larger than the hikers by a large margin, but the ground had been too hard that day to form a reliable cast. We were working off of indentations in the grass and leaves. After scouring the ground and turning up empty-handed, we looked up. We found fur in the trees, oddly enough, and a branch some 20 feet above the campground that had recently been broken. Quickly, one of our theories jumped ahead of the pack. We traced a line from the campsite to the place where the tent was recovered. We checked the trees all along that path. More broken branches and in one case a torn piece of fabric likely ripped from our missing hiker. Whatever had taken them had grabbed them, tent and all, carried them into the trees, and then leaped from branch to branch. It sounded impossible. What could be so strong and so nimble? We were determined to find out. When the rest of the Park Service discovered the hiker, surprisingly in stable condition, we had another point to investigate. The other team cleared out quickly, more concerned with the hiker's well-being than with our monster hunt. But we noticed it right away. The details they had missed. They had pulled her out of a den. The area smelled faintly of urine and animal hide. We could see 3 locations where the brush had been gathered and pressed flat into makeshift beds. There was a mound of earth where something had recently been dug up and buried. Before we had any more time to investigate, the creatures who lived there came home. There was a knocking on a nearby tree. How a man might knock on his own door when he's left the key inside. When we looked, we saw a flash of broad shoulders and fur diving deeper into the woods. There a howl came from the opposite direction. We spun around, trying to chase the furry shapes in the trees with our eyes. When the next sound came from above us, we froze. It was the whine of wood bending beyond its limit. We knew what that meant. At least one of them was above us. We looked up to see massive feet folded around one of the branches. The man-shaped beast was hunched on the branch, looking down at us with an open mouth and wide eyes. We sprayed bear spray into the wind and started to run. We hoped it would be enough to disorient whatever we had seen. Sure enough, It worked. We safely arrived back at our local office and filed a report about our encounter. We made plans to journey back into the woods and to investigate the creatures, to determine why they had attacked. When we got back, they weren't there. They tossed their own nest, unburied whatever had been hidden in the mound, and disappeared. That's why this story gets told, even though it might not have the most action and it might not be the most fun. I tell this story because we still don't have the answers. We're still scratching our head about it all these years later. That's our responsibility, you know? We're the ones who find the answers. I tell this story because it's the one that ends with a warning. And if I don't warn you, there's a chance that no one will. If you're out in the woods, keep your head on a swivel. Secure your perimeter and remember to look up. All right, here we go. I was born and raised in California, but my folks were originally from Maine. They moved to the West Coast for work shortly before tying the knot. I came into the picture about a year later. So every year we'd pack up the car and head back to Maine to hang out with my grandparents for a couple of weeks. Now, I've always been a fan of the hustle and bustle of city life, so the quiet countryside of Maine where my grandparents lived was a bit of a change for me. They were near the Canadian border, living in this snug little farmhouse that got pretty cramped when we all crammed in there, especially when my little brother and sister were born. The one year I didn't make it to Maine was when I was a junior in high school. I got to go to Japan for a school exchange program. And wouldn't you know it, my granddad, who we affectionately called Gramps, passed away about a month later. The rest of my family was there, so I felt comfort knowing they were with him towards the end. A week after Gramps' passing, we found ourselves driving back to Maine for the funeral. It was a long 9-hour drive, and I was with my brother in our car, while my sister tagged along with our parents. We got there late in the evening, had a home-cooked meal by Grams, and then pretty much everyone just crashed from the journey. The next day was the funeral. There was a small service at the local church that Gramps used to go to, and then the burial at the town's cemetery, a good half-hour drive from Graham's house. Afterwards, Grams had folks over for a little get-together and lunch. I met many of their friends from around the area, and while they were a bit different from the city folks I was used to, everyone was genuinely nice. The drive and the funeral had taken a toll on me and my siblings, so after lunch we decided to go outside and get some fresh air. Grams and Gramps had a bit over 10 acres of land that led up to a pretty steep hill, not quite a mountain, but close enough. It was filled with pine trees and looked really dense. Gramps had an old hunting cabin somewhere up there, and we decided to hike up to it for old time's sake. We hadn't been to the cabin since we were kids, so finding it was a bit of an adventure. It looked like Gramps hadn't been there in a while, but we ended up just chilling on the ground underneath the cabin, reminiscing about the good times with Gramps. We didn't always see eye to eye as siblings, but Gramps' passing made us put our differences aside. As my brother Jake was chatting about wanting to visit Japan like I did, we heard this weird thump. We looked around, puzzled, but then everything went quiet again and we resumed our conversation. But then bam, 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 4 more thumps in quick succession. To me, it sounded like rocks being thrown against trees. My sister Lucy stood up immediately, saying she wanted to head back to the house. I could tell she was a little spooked. We were about a 15-minute walk deep into the woods. I tried to stay cool as I got up, but I noticed that the woods were eerily quiet. No chirping of birds or rustling of squirrels, which is usually a sign of a larger predator nearby. Grants taught us that when we were kids, but I wasn't sure if Jake or Lucy remembered. Trying to keep Lucy calm, I started guiding us back the way we came, all the while chattering about anything and everything I could think of. Jake was starting to look a bit uneasy too. Then he stopped dead in his tracks, pointed and said, "Moose?" But it sounded more like a question than a statement. What he was pointing at was hunched over and a dark brown color, not like any moose I'd ever seen before. It was massive, bigger than a horse for sure. And as we watched it, the creature stood up. I realized it was standing on two legs and was looking right at us. But instead of the long snout and antlers I was expecting, the face was eerily human-like. Still covered in fur, but with a human nose and ears. It was maybe 200 feet away. Lucy took off running without a second thought, and Jake and I were right behind her. We sprinted back to the house and burst through the front door. Grams must have seen us from the window because she immediately asked us what was wrong. Lucy was too shaken to speak, but I tried my best to explain what we saw, even though I knew it sounded absolutely bonkers. To my surprise, Grams didn't seem fazed at all. She mentioned that Gramps used to talk about seeing those things in the woods. Apparently there were a few of them, but they usually kept to the deeper parts of the hill. She mused, "I wonder if they knew he's gone and came down to pay their respects." As crazy as it sounded at the time, as I've grown older, I find myself wondering the same thing. They've been here for as long as I can remember. They were here when my mother was a child. They were here when her mother was a child. The little things in the woods, I didn't believe them for the longest time. I thought the glimpses I'd seen in my youth were the result of childish fantasy. They became very real for me once I started in these woods. Once the woods became my business, my profession, and my very way of life, the trees opened up little secrets for me. They are the forest's oldest secrets. Thieves and monsters, cruel and venomous. They're snakes on 2 feet. They're wasps that can only fly as far as they can fall, but their stingers still find you all the same. The first time I saw them, really saw them, I thought I was dreaming. I thought I was having a stroke brought on by too many hours in the sun. I never did drink enough water to make up for my long treks through the wilderness. I saw them at the riverside and I mistook them for beavers. How could I have known that they were only wearing those animals as coats? I watched a while, leaned forward from my shaded spot beneath the trees. When I saw pale, crooked fingers peek out from the folds in the animal hide, shakily aiming a ladle for the flow of the roaring water, I think I would have gasped, was it not for the twig that broke beneath my heel and sent an icicle of dread into my heart. The things didn't look back. They knew they were spotted and they didn't like it. They ran, scurrying along the river until they disappeared into the reeds. I sat there for a while, in the place where my cover had been blown. Had I really seen 5 tiny fingers come out of that animal? Or was it the product of my adult imagination? Stress and a lack of nutrition could have led to something like that, right? No, I decided. I'd seen that little hand. When I stood up from the knoll overlooking the river, I knew that I was going to see more. I wanted to learn everything I could about those creatures. The first person I called was my mother. She, much to my surprise, didn't want to talk about them. I pushed and pried for information. Eventually, she cracked. I learned that they used to steal tools and livestock from the communities nearby. Hammers and chickens would go missing, with little footprints left behind in the dirt. How had no one captured them? Why weren't there any pictures online? I learned that there were actually... Look around long enough and I guess you can really find anything on the internet. It wasn't enough to satisfy me, though. I wanted to see them in person. I wanted to know exactly what I had discovered. I stalked that river for weeks. Went mad, I think. Eventually, I was there more often than not, smelling of fresh water and mossy stone. I'd wish I could call it my typical hyperfixation. It was a little different then, a little overboard. I thought I was chasing something magical. Maybe I was trying to get back in touch with my childhood self. I guess I was bored with my career by then. Either way, if I had known anything tangible about the creatures I was facing, I would have turned back. I found a cave. It easily could have been mistaken for an animal den. I was lucky to know what to look for. The tiny, tightly knit footprints almost looked feline. I think they designed it that way. It was the track pattern that was off, The rhythm told me that the creatures stood upright. A peek inside with my flashlight caught bits of silver and rust. Spoons and forks were hanging from twine, seemingly repurposed into shovels and rakes. They were mounted like tools might be mounted in a shed. I thought to creep in closer, to crawl into the cave's mouth on my hands and knees. It was hardly big enough for a dog to squeeze through. But then my flashlight caught something else. The shimmer of eyes, reflective like a cat's. Small and beady, but shaped all wrong. They scanned me left to right, then one pair turned into two and two pairs turned into three. There were a half-dozen little faces staring back at me before long. By then, I couldn't run. I was transfixed. I was terrified. But I was so close to the thing I'd been hunting that I could practically feel the warmth of success pumping through my veins. Then they ran at me. They scurried like rats. The light from outside the caves crested on their faces and revealed their gnarled expressions. Their skin looked like leather. Their wrinkles looked cut from the bark of a tree. They were hard and evil-looking little creatures. And as they ran, they snarled. They screamed. Not one of them was taller than my knee, but I wasn't interested in fighting off the pack. I'd gotten what I'd came for. I'd found them. I knew the truth now, that the people-shaped creatures did exist out in those woods. I tore out of there like the forest was burning down around me. I ran all the way to my car. I drove all the way home. I showed for hours and cried under the water. I don't know why the tears fell except for the fact that I was overwhelmed. The stories from my childhood had been validated, and in their new real form they were nasty. I called my mother again and she told me what I'll tell you now. Don't go looking for the secrets that the forest doesn't want to share. There is proof out there. I could go back out there and maybe even acquire it. Capture one of the beasts in a net or a cage. But it's been done, hasn't it? I grew up in Ybor City in Tampa, Florida, and have always been fascinated by the unexplained. My parents instilled a hard work ethic and taught me to always be observant in order to get ahead in life. As a self-proclaimed paranormal expert, I have always kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. As the owner of a small computer store in town, I noticed a sudden decline in business. At first, I thought it was just a rough patch or the state of the economy. However, as time went on, I became more and more convinced that something strange was going on. Customers were no longer coming in, and my profits were dwindling. I knew I had to investigate the situation and find out what was really going on. It all started when I noticed the owner of a competing computer store across town seemed to always be one step ahead of me. No matter what promotion or sale I offered, he had a better one. It was as if he knew exactly what I was planning before I even did. I found this strange, but didn't think much of it at the time. It may sound obsessive, but I began to investigate him and his store and watch his every move. The more I watched, the more convinced I became that there was something seriously fishy going on. His behavior was strange, and there were some things that just didn't add up. For one thing, he never left. Ever. It was as if he lived there full time. I never once saw him leave. He didn't go to lunch. He didn't go home after work. It seemed like a was in that shop working 24/7. As I continued my investigation, I noticed more and more strange things. He would often have secret meetings with shady-looking people in the back of his store, and there were times when his eyes seemed to glow in a strange way. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something was off. I didn't involve anyone else in my investigation as I didn't want to risk anyone thinking I was insane. However, I did confide in my spouse about my suspicions, and they were supportive but skeptical. I guess it was understandable, but through thick and thin, your spouse is supposed to have your back. As time went on, my fear and anxiety increased. The more I uncovered, the more convinced I became that the owner of the competing store was up to something nasty. I had to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. I began to do some research on the strange occurrences and behavior I had witnessed. I eventually came across some information that led me to believe that the owner of the competing store was a lizard man. According to my research, there are lizard men in elite circles such as the Illuminati, and it all started in the late 20th century. They seem to have gotten their powers from the ancient Sumerian deity Enki, who is often depicted as a serpent or reptilian figure. Lizard men and reptilian humanoids are often members of elite secret societies like the Illuminati and are said to secretly control world events. Lizard men are not only real but are also involved in a global conspiracy to subjugate humanity. There is tons of evidence online of the shape-shifting abilities of some world leaders and the prevalence of reptilian symbolism in popular culture. There are many who dismiss this as pseudo-scientific or paranoid delusions, but standing right in front of me was a lizard man with glowing eyes, and he was stealing my livelihood. After uncovering all this information, I confronted the owner of the store and accused him of being involved in some sort of conspiracy. He told me I was crazy and called the cops on me. The cops questioned me, but I told them I was just looking to strike up a partnership with another computer store in the area and that he was just trying to make his competition look bad. Turns out what I said to get out of a bind was, in fact, completely true. He hired people to leave negative Yelp reviews for my store and tarnish my good name, and who knows how much it has cost me. Some of my customers have told me that every time they go into his store, he is talking about how my business is a front for illegal activities, and he tells people that I'm involved with a satanic cult. I couldn't believe that someone could be so ruthless and cruel. I finally decided to take action. My friend agreed to take his phone in there and record what the guy said. He casually asked the store owner if he knew anything about my business, and the hateful lies that spewed out of his mouth were outrageous. After having him on tape slandering my good name and my business's name, I gave my evidence to my lawyer and we were able to reach a sizable settlement, and the man has moved elsewhere and taken his shady ways out of my beloved community. I also reached out to other business owners in the area and warned them about him, his creepy secret society, his slanderous ways, and how vulnerable we are to these lizard men. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I was able to take him down and bring justice to Ybor City and have rebuilt my reputation slowly but surely. Looking back on this experience, I feel a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I am proud of myself for standing up to this lizard man and fighting for what I believe in. On the other hand, I am still haunted by the thought that there are people out there who are willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead, even if it means hurting others. This experience has taught me to be more vigilant and aware of the world around me. It has also shown me that even the most seemingly absurd theories can have some basis in reality. But most of all, it has given me a renewed sense of hope and confidence that I can overcome any obstacle if I remain true to my values and work hard. One word of wisdom, friends: beware the lizard men. They are real, and as good as I feel these days, I constantly feel like I shook up a hornet's nest, and it's just a matter of time before he gets his fellow lizard people to strike me down. I've been an avid hunter my entire life. Some of my fondest memories are of going on hunting trips in Michigan with my dad as a kid. He taught me so much, and we used to spend so much quality time together back in the day. I really miss him. Every time I go hunting now, the memories come pouring back and I can still feel his presence with me. A few months ago, I went to his old hunting cabin deep in the woods on the 1-year anniversary of his death. It was my way of honoring him and think it was what he would have wanted. But I don't think he could ever prepare me for what I saw on that trip. I honestly figured I would be such an emotional mess that I wouldn't be able to get any real tracking done, and thought that it would just be good to get out there and think about all the good times we had together. But to my own amazement, I was able to track a nice 10-point buck that would walk right across one of our old deer stands. I figured it would be a great way to honor the old man, and I could make some nice venison backstrap like we used to do together. So I was out in the woods tracking the buck for a few hours, and I heard something big rustling around in the bushes. I thought it was the deer, But when I got closer, I saw something really strange. It was this huge animal that walked on its hind legs. This thing was super tall, like 7 feet tall, and it had these crazy glowing blue eyes. I'd never seen anything like it before. It was crazy. His face looked kind of like a wolf, but kind of looked demonic and sort of like a human, but not at the same time. It was a horrifying combination. It had hair all over its body and had big, bulging muscles. I guess I was in shock because I just stood there with my rifle and froze. I didn't know how to react, and I couldn't move. I was so freaked out. Then the beast looked right at me with its freaky blue eyes and sort of hunched over. We both froze and stared at each other for a good while. I couldn't tell which of us was more surprised, me or it. Then all of a sudden, the beast let out this wicked roar that sounded like multiple animals at once. It was awful, and it freaked me out so badly that I just unloaded the whole magazine of rounds at him. I'm not sure if I hit him or not, but thankfully it was enough to scare the beast off, and it took off into the woods. I got my bearings about me and ran back toward the cabin as quickly as I could. I slammed the cabin door shut and kept my rifle aimed at the door in case the beast wanted revenge. I spent pretty much the entire night like that, but luckily I didn't see the beast again that night. I was freaked out and didn't sleep a wink. The next morning I called up all my hunting buddies and described what I had seen, but they all told me I just had too many brewskis and didn't believe a word of it. I was freaked out, and I cut my hunting trip short and figured I had done my daddy proud. I didn't catch a deer, but I stumbled across the scariest beast in all of America. That was one for the books. After I got home, I hopped on the World Wide Web and got to searching around on the internet to see if anyone else had seen something like what I had seen. Turns out I'm not the only one. I found a lot of information on something called the Michigan Dog Man. The physical description matches exactly what I saw. 7 feet tall, standing on its hind legs with huge muscles. Oddly enough, some of the people who have claimed to have seen the dog man claim it had orange eyes, and some claim it was blue like the one I had seen. I became pretty obsessed with it after that and read everything about the dog man that I could get my hands on. I went back to Dad's old cabin and checked all the trail cams to see if it had picked any pictures up. Sure enough, there was my 10-point buck taunting me, but I didn't get a single picture of the dog man. I set up cameras all over the place and have spent pretty much every weekend I can up in the cabin trying to find the dog man again. I've returned to the place where I first spotted him, but can't find any tracks or anything to lead me to him. The beast is elusive, but I'll spend the rest of my life tracking him down if I have to. I've always been a God-fearing man, but never believed in Bigfoot, UFOs, aliens, and all that kind of stuff. But seeing the dog man with my own 2 eyes has completely changed my mind about all of that. It made me realize how close-minded I've been my whole life. Just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean it hasn't happened to anyone else in the world. And the frustration I felt when trying to explain what I experienced to my best friends only to be shut down and ridiculed. That just ain't right. The truth is that we have no idea what's really out there. What's really going on. I've stopped watching the news because I now believe that the news that's being shoved down our throats is more like propaganda trying to get us to think and behave a certain way. The truth I found from my own experience has been right in front of our eyes all along. We're just being programmed to not use our God-given sense and to just listen to whatever they want us to believe. We heard the howling for weeks. Before that, it was the shrieking of our chickens at 4 a.m. The animals always heard it coming long before we did. We learned to listen for those chickens. We listened for the cows in their stalls. We listened for our old bloodhound, who would anxious pace the halls with one eye glued to the front door. We always thought that was funny. Whatever it was outside, we never expected it to come through the front door. We never expected it to come to the house at all. That shows how little we knew, huh? The howling started in the summer, early June. It was so far away the first night that we mistook it for the wind. We thought a dry thunderstorm might be coming in from the west. the same direction as the forest at the edge of our farmland. When the wind and thunder ripples through those trees, the forest makes all sorts of unholy sounds. We thought the howls were the same sort, terrifying in nature but harmless in reality. That was another mistake. Each night the sounds got closer. On the first night, our hound had merely pointed her ears toward the window. The next night she faced the glass and growled. Then the pacing began. By that third night, it was as the thunder had descended on just our farm. The howls were deafening. They occurred so late in the night that we had no hopes of preparing for them. We tried to stay up, to spot whatever was out there for ourselves, but each time our old age caught up to us and lulled us to a bitter sleep. 4 a.m., almost like clockwork, we'd wake to a disturbance. We'd run to the door, sometimes armed and sometimes not, rushing into the porch to yell at our mysterious intruder. They were always gone. The bestial shrieking would always end the moment we opened the door. The cows would murmur and quiet down. The chickens would clean their feathers. What could we do, we wondered? How could we trap this thing? How could we get our eyes on it in order to understand just what we were dealing with? We didn't come up with any genius plan. We hired back one of our old farmhands, a sturdy boy with a military past that he rarely spoke about. We described what we were dealing with, and he agreed to sit up on our porch waiting for the beast to come. We thought that would settle it. We knew he was a crack shot with a rifle. We knew he wouldn't scare easy. That night, the howling was louder than ever before. It wasn't loud enough to hide that man's screaming. While the howl was low and as smooth as the breeze, our farmhand's cries were sharp, piercing, and erratic. He was attacked. We were sure of it. No man would scream like that unless they were being ripped apart. When we joined him on the porch, however, it was clear that the man was in one piece. As before, when we opened the door, the invader fled. Our guard stood trembling on the porch, skin as white as bone and eyes as wide as a flower in the sun. It didn't make sense to us then, but he was rambling about a man. We thought whatever he'd seen must have triggered some dormant memories from his time in the military. There was no way that the howling we'd heard was made by a human being. That was our last night with a guard on our porch. We recommitted ourselves in that moment to spot the creature on our own. As terrified as our farmhand was, we were relieved to know that thus far the monster had yet to attack any of our livestock. Initially, we wanted to protect our land. We wanted to repel the invader. Something about the farmhand's encounter steered us closer toward morbid curiosity. We didn't think we were in danger. We just wanted to know. We wanted to solve the mystery that had rolled across our farm like a cloud of fog. We sat on our porch with a pot of coffee and a checkers board between us. We made it to 2 a.m. We woke yet again to the ruckus. This time the fence around our chickens was groaning and spitting, bending and breaking under some immense pressure. We chased the sound. The howling was a whimper. When we finally cornered it, we saw the beast was snared by the fractured ends of our own fence. The farm itself had caught the invader, not us. Now its arm was pinned by 2 planks of snapped wood. We had spent weeks waiting for this moment, and now that it was upon us, we were as insignificant as the hens anxiously pattering on the other side of the fence. The beast was in front of us. Now what? We were baffled for one simple reason. The farmhand had been right. We were looking at a man. His back was engorged, swollen and curved to the point that his spine appeared to be shaped like a scythe. From head to toe, he was covered in thin, wiry fur. He snarled when he looked at us. Spit ran from his lips to his chin. His teeth were pointed, more canine than primate. What were we looking at? We raised our rifle and took aim. We had to be rid of this beast after all. Then, behind us, true thunder finally cracked in the cruelest dry storm of the season. It cracked like a whip, and we jumped out of our skin, expecting there to be another monster behind us. We turned, misfired the weapon and stumbled. The beast tore itself free. It ran. We fired another shot but missed. It stayed away from our farm after that. Our hound still paces the hallways when the summer rolls in, but we haven't heard the howl in years. What about you, I wonder? Have you heard anything like this before?